In just a short span near Pokrovsk, the battlefield began to look far more dangerous than a normal frontline clash. What happened there was not simply another case of Russian troops losing a few vehicles on a contested road. It felt like something deeper was being exposed. Movement itself was starting to look unsafe. Routes that should have carried men forward suddenly looked like traps. Places that seemed close enough to the rear no longer felt protected. And the most disturbing part was not only the destruction, but the sense that once something was seen, its chances of survival fell very fast. That is what makes this story so serious. Pokrovsk is no longer only a place where attacks happen. It is becoming a place where every stage of movement, recovery, and protection may already be under pressure before the real clash even begins. So, the real question is not only what was hit near Pokrovsk, but what this reveals about how the battle there is changing. Stay with military force because the real story is far bigger than a few burning vehicles. The first strike near Pokrovsk shows that the road to the front is no longer a path of movement, but a zone of exposure. A Russian vehicle carrying troops was still on its approach route when a Ukrainian drone spotted it from above. That detail matters because the attack did not begin at the trench line or during close combat. It began much earlier, while the men were still inside the vehicle and before they could spread out, hide, or prepare for action. In practical terms, that means the danger now starts in transit. For a sector like Pokrovsk, where short supply runs and fast troop movement often shape the tempo of local fighting, that change is serious. It turns routine movement into a gamble and puts pressure on every stage of deployment before the real clash even begins. The driver tried to save the vehicle by speeding up and swerving away from the threat, but the effort only showed how narrow the margin for survival had become. Under drone pressure, the vehicle lost control and slid into a roadside ditch. That moment says a lot about the battlefield. The drone did not need to destroy the transport in the first second to succeed. It only had to force a mistake, break the route, and trap the target in open ground. Once the vehicle went off the road, its options collapsed very fast. It could no longer keep moving with confidence, and it could no longer function as protected transport for the soldiers inside. A road that should have carried men safely toward the line suddenly became the place where their vulnerability was exposed most clearly. And that made the approaching strike much more than a simple hit on a moving target. The FPV then turned back, corrected its line, and flew straight into the stranded vehicle. That second phase is important because it shows control, patience, and intent. This was not a random collision or a lucky camera shot. It was a deliberate finishing move against a target that had already been forced into a weak position. Then another drone was sent in to strike again until the transport caught fire and was fully destroyed. That follow-up attack is what gives the episode its wider meaning. Ukraine was not trying only to scare the crew or delay their arrival. The goal was to remove the vehicle from the battle completely and make sure the troops inside lost both mobility and cover at the same time. In cost terms, this is also part of the new logic of war, where a relatively cheap drone can destroy equipment, disrupt plans, and block manpower before it even reaches the front. What happened on that road near Pokrovsk reveals a deeper shift in how this front now works. When troop carriers are being hunted before unloading, the battle no longer starts where soldiers first open fire. It starts behind the main line, on the roads that feed men into it. That changes the meaning of movement itself. A transport run becomes part of the combat zone, and every approach route becomes a place where units can be broken early. For Russian forces, that means even getting troops to the right place is becoming harder, slower, and more dangerous. For Ukraine, it means drones are doing more than destroying machines. They are shaping the battle before the assault can even form, and that pressure only grows heavier from here. The second vehicle made the pattern even clearer, because this was no longer just a single successful strike on one road near Pokrovsk. Another Russian transport moved along the same supply route, and a Ukrainian drone quickly locked onto it from above. What matters here is not only that the vehicle was found, but that it was followed as if the battlefield itself had already marked it for destruction. This suggests a wider level of control over movement near the front. In this kind of environment, the road is no longer just a line between the rear and the line of contact. It becomes a channel under watch, where one detected target can lead to another, and where survival depends not only on speed, but on whether anything can move unseen at all. That is where the logic of this battle starts to change. The drone did not strike once and disappeared. It stayed with the target, attacked again and again, and kept pressure on it until the vehicle could no longer move and had to be abandoned. That repeated pursuit is the key point in this episode. Ukraine was not aiming for a temporary delay or a brief disruption. The goal was to make sure the transport was removed from the battlefield as a working asset. That difference is important because a damaged vehicle can still carry men, supplies, or ammunition if it escapes far enough. A disabled one becomes dead weight on the route and a problem for everyone behind it. This kind of attack also puts pressure on time. Every extra second under pursuit increases panic, burns fuel, narrows choices, and raises the chance that a crew will lose control or leave the vehicle before reaching safety. And that is where the danger begins to spread beyond the machine itself. After the vehicle was put out of action, some Russian soldiers tried to return to the area to search for supplies or recover equipment that might still be useful. On an older battlefield, that might have been a practical step. Here, it became another risk. By going back to the wreck, they exposed themselves to drones still watching the area from above. This is one of the strongest details in the whole sequence because it shows that the strike did not end with the vehicle. The space around the destroyed transport also remained under threat. In effect, the wreck became a trap. Men who needed ammunition, gear, or basic survival items were forced to choose between losing those resources and exposing themselves in open terrain. That weakens any effort to regroup after the first loss, and it turns a single hit into a continuing problem for the unit as a whole. That is what makes the pressure around Pokrovsk feel far more severe. This is where a new rule of the modern battlefield becomes hard to ignore. Surviving the first attack no longer means escaping the danger. The threat now stays in place, watches what happens after impact, and expands toward anyone trying to repair the damage. That reduces the chance of recovering wounded personnel, reusing equipment, or restoring order after a strike. It also means logistics are being attacked in layers, not just at the moment of movement, but at the moment of return and rescue as well. In simple terms, Ukraine is not only breaking vehicles, it is breaking the process that allows a force to absorb losses and keep operating. And once that process starts to fail, the pressure naturally moves toward even more valuable targets. The strikes on the road mattered, but the attack on the P-18 radar showed something even more serious because the pressure was now moving from vehicles to the systems that help protect the whole sector. After Ukrainian drones hit transport and infantry along the approach routes, a Russian P-18 surveillance radar was detected and struck as well. That is important because assets like this are not usually placed carelessly near danger unless they are serving a real need. A radar of this kind is a high-value target, not only because of its price, but because of what it does for the force behind it. It helps detect threats early, track low-flying objects, and pass warnings to units that may have only seconds to react. Once such a system is hit, the battlefield changes in a quiet but dangerous way. And that is where this story starts to rise from a local clash into something larger. The P-18 matters because modern fighting depends on seeing danger before danger arrives. A force that can detect low-altitude movement has a better chance of warning air defense crews, repositioning equipment, or protecting routes that are already under pressure. When that radar is damaged or destroyed, those reaction times shrink fast. In simple terms, the side under attack becomes less able to read the air above it and less able to protect the ground below it. That is why this was more than just another drone strike caught on camera. It was a blow against the early warning layer that helps hold a front together. If troop carriers are the blood flow pushing men toward the line, then radar is part of the nervous system that tells the force what is coming. And once that nervous system is hurt, every later movement becomes more risky. What made the situation worse was that the radar was not the only important target hit that day. A separate Russian air defense system was also destroyed, which further weakened local protection against drones and missiles. That detail gives the episode much greater weight because it suggests these were not isolated losses happening by chance. They formed a pattern. One strike reduced visibility, and another reduced the ability to respond with force. Together, those losses cut into both awareness and protection at the same time. That combination is dangerous on any front, but especially near Pokrovsk, where repeated drone pressure is already forcing Russian units to move, hide, and resupply under constant risk. When both the eyes and the shield begin to thin out in the same period, the area behind the line becomes less secure, and the next wave of attacks becomes easier to carry out. That is when a tactical problem starts becoming a system problem. There is also a clear cost imbalance in this part of the story, and it says a great deal about how the war is evolving. The source material describes the P-18 radar as a rare and valuable asset, and it places its cost in the range of roughly $2 to $3 million. The same material says another Russian air defense system destroyed that day was worth about $25 million. Against that, Ukraine is using drones that are much cheaper and much easier to replace. That gap matters because it forces one side to risk expensive military hardware against tools that cost only a fraction as much. Over time, that is not just a tactical issue, it becomes a strategic burden. A military can survive individual losses, but repeated exchanges like that slowly drain confidence, protection, and resources all at once. And once that protective layer starts to crack, the pressure naturally falls back on the forces still trying to move underneath it. The strike on the two support vehicles showed that Ukraine was not only destroying targets, but breaking the timing of the Russian attack before it could fully come together. These vehicles were reportedly moving forward to provide covering fire for the assault group behind them, yet they were detected early while still on the road. That detail matters because fire support is not an extra part of an assault. It is often what allows the next wave to move with less risk and more speed. When Ukrainian drones intercepted those vehicles before they reached their firing positions, the effect went beyond material loss. It disrupted the order in which the attack was supposed to unfold. In a place like Pokrovsk, where short movement windows can decide whether a push gains ground or stalls, losing that first layer of support can damage the whole effort before the infantry behind it even gets close. What makes this episode important is the role those vehicles were meant to play. They were not just moving pieces of metal on a road. They were part of a planned sequence. Their job was likely to suppress Ukrainian positions, draw attention, and create enough pressure for the following troops to approach more safely. Once they were hit early, the Russian force behind them did not simply lose two machines. It lost a key part of its attack structure. Without that supporting fire, the men coming after them faced a harder approach, a less protected advance, and a much weaker sense of timing. That changes the whole shape of the battlefield. A coordinated push depends on vehicles, infantry, spacing, and fire all working together in a narrow window. When one part is removed too early, the rest do not move with the same confidence. And that is where the battlefield begins to punish any force that cannot keep its sequence intact. This is why the tactical meaning of the strike goes further than the damage seen on camera. Ukraine was hitting the formation process of the Russian attack itself. In other words, the drones were striking before Russian units could gather enough vehicles, enough men, enough firepower, and enough distance control to make the assault work as planned. That kind of pressure is especially dangerous because it breaks cohesion before the decisive phase begins. A group that should have moved as one now starts to split into smaller, weaker elements. Those scattered elements are easier to spot, easier to isolate, and much harder to support once they come under pressure. Speed also suffers. A force that loses tempo near the line is forced to pause, adjust, and improvise under threat. That usually creates hesitation, and hesitation in drone-watch terrain often becomes another form of exposure. And that is where the damage starts spreading beyond the first impact points. At Pokrovsk, this suggests that drones are doing far more than hunting visible targets of opportunity. They are becoming tools for battle management, because they are helping Ukraine decide when the Russian movement will fail and where a push will start to lose shape. By cutting off support vehicles early, Ukrainian operators are attacking the links between layers of the Russian force, not just the layers themselves. That means the real result is not counted only in destroyed equipment, but in broken coordination and a weaker assault rhythm. A push that should have arrived with support now arrives in fragments, and fragments rarely hold momentum for long. This is what makes the fighting near Pokrovsk look different from a simple exchange of fire. One side is not waiting for the other to fully appear before striking. It is interfering with the attack while it is still being assembled, and that sets the stage for even more dangerous pressure on the troops forced to move without cover. Leaving the vehicle no longer guarantees survival, and that may be the clearest sign of how much the battlefield near Pokrovsk has changed. After several Russian vehicles were intercepted, some soldiers jumped out of cars or quad bikes as soon as drones appeared overhead. They ran toward trees, shallow cover, or rough positions nearby, hoping distance from the vehicle would improve their chances. In older forms of fighting, that often worked. Here, it did not. Many were still found and attacked after they scattered. That detail matters because it shows the danger is no longer tied only to the machine that was first hit. The threat now follows the men after they leave it, which means exposure continues even after the first moment of contact. And that turns every escape into another phase of the same attack. This completes the larger pattern seen across the sequence near Pokrovsk. First, the target is detected on the road. Then the vehicle is struck or forced to stop. After that, the area around the wreck stays under watch. Then the infantry that breaks away is hunted in smaller groups. By the time soldiers reach thin tree cover or a shallow fighting position, they are no longer moving from danger to safety. They are moving from one kind of exposure to another. That is a major change in battlefield reality because it shrinks the space where troops can recover, reorganize, or simply stay alive long enough to keep operating. Once that space begins to disappear, even small movement becomes high risk. And that is where drone warfare starts changing behavior, not just tactics. The bomber drones in this sequence make the pressure even more serious. They did not focus only on moving vehicles. They also dropped munitions on shelters, abandoned equipment, and remaining groups of soldiers. That shows Ukraine is not acting through isolated drone crews making random strikes. What appears instead is a layered network of surveillance and attack, where one system finds movement and another exploits it. In simple terms, this is not just about hitting what can be seen. It is about keeping watch long enough to hit what appears after the first strike. A tree line, a shallow dugout, or a damaged vehicle may offer a few seconds, but not real safety. And that is what makes the front around Pokrovsk feel more dangerous. The deeper goal is not only to inflict casualties, it is to block reinforcement and resupply before they can strengthen the line. When roads, hiding places, abandoned vehicles, and scattered infantry are all under the same watch, almost every movement can become a target. That is why Pokrovsk now reveals a new form of battlefield control, and that is what gives the conclusion its force. What stands out most near Pokrovsk is that Ukraine is no longer using drones only as strike tools. It is using them as a way to control the shape of the battle itself. The pressure now begins while vehicles are still moving, continues when troops are forced to scatter, and stays in place even when survivors try to recover supplies, reach cover, or depend on radar and air defense behind them. That is a major shift in how this fight works. Once drones start doing more than destroying targets, once they begin disrupting logistics, breaking assault timing, and weakening the systems that protect the rear, the real damage is no longer measured only by burning vehicles or damaged positions. It is measured by how fast one side starts losing its ability to organize, reinforce, and keep pressure on the front. Near Pokrovsk, that change is becoming harder to ignore because the battlefield is starting to look less like a line of contact and more like a zone of constant exposure. Movement is dangerous, delay is costly, and even short attempts to regroup can quickly attract another wave of pressure from above. This means the battle is no longer decided only by who has more men or more armor at the point of attack. It is increasingly shaped by who can still move safely, who can still hide long enough to prepare, and who can still keep a damaged system working under repeated disruption. And if this pattern continues near Pokrovsk, the bigger question will not only be how many troops Russia can still move forward, but how much initiative it can still hold under a sky that is becoming harder to survive. Subscribe to Military Force for more.